A few weeks ago on Facebook, I mentioned that I was going to be doing some videos on adding borders to your knitting. The first of those videos is a garter stitch border like I have here. This is the first swatch that I knit. This is just a yarn over knit two together pattern. I cast on 16 stitches, then I knit the first stitch and worked yarn over knit two together to my last stitch, and then I just knit the last stitch. So you can see here the edges are kind of sloppy and it's not very pretty. For this second swatch I added 4 stitches to each side of my pattern, so 8 extra stitches, a total of 24 for a garter stitch border, and then I knit 3 rows before beginning my yarn over knit two together pattern. And then I did 3 more rows before I did the bind off. So, of course, when you add extra stitches for a border, it's going to increase the size of your fabric. So that's something that you'll want to take into consideration when you're designing your project, like a scarf or rectangular shawl or whatever it might be. So I have my 16 cast on here for the one that I'm going to put the garter stitch border onto. And let's say that I want my border on each side to be 4 garter stitches. So that means that I would need to cast on 8 additional stitches. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Now I'm just going to work a few rows in garter stitch before I begin my yarn over knit two together pattern. So this really could be as many rows as you want it to be, just keeping in mind that however many rows you work before you begin your main stitch pattern, you will also be working that same number of rows before you bind off, and that of course is going to add to the size of your finished item. Okay, so it's 3 rows in garter stitch. I'm ready to start the first row of my stitch pattern here. And you can put stitch markers after your border stitches to separate those from your main pattern if you want. Usually I only have a few stitches, so I don't bother with the stitch marker. I just try to remember that I have, say 4 stitches at the beginning and then 4 at the end of each row to work. So I will always be knitting these first 4 stitches. And then for my stitch pattern, it was knit 1 and then yarn over knit 2 together. So I'm going to knit 1 stitch and then yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, Whoops. Okay, so I'm at the end of what would be my pattern repeat here. And I know that these 4 are for my border, and then this 1 stitch left is for my stitch pattern. And I'll just knit, and then knit the last 4 stitches. Those last 4 stitches will always be knit. Okay. So I'm turning my work. And this is just going to be the same thing for every row. I'll be knitting the first 4. Now I'm going to start my stitch pattern. I'll knit the first stitch, and then I'll work a yarn over, knit 2 together until I get to the last stitch of my pattern. Okay, I'm at the last stitch for my pattern, so I knit, and then knit the last 4 for my border. And I'll just continue working that way until I'm ready to do the garter stitch border at the top of my work. But you can see already how it looks. Okay, so now I would like to end my work here. I'm just going to knit the same number of rows that I worked at the beginning. So that's going to be 3 rows of garter stitch that I'll be working before I bind off my little swatch here. Okay, finishing up the 3rd row of my garter stitch here. And now I will just bind off. You can use any bind off, of course, that you like.
Start. Can you please have a cupcake, please?
Okay, so that finishes up my sample here. You cut your tail and weave in your ends, of course, if you were actually making something.